Well, this will be our last lecture for the first century, and you've seen this timeline before. A couple things that I do want to talk about today would be some of the persecutions that were happening in early Christianity. And we'll start during the time of the apostles. We'll talk about the apostle Stephen and what happened to him. We'll then go and look at the Great Fire of Rome, and I've got quite a bit of text during this particular section, and what I'll do is I will give you a tag where you can click on and then read the whole text if you're interested in that. We'll talk a bit about the Jewish Revolt and what was happening during that time, and then we'll spend the rest of the lecture talking about these emperors, Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and Emperor Domitian, and what they were doing in terms of persecuting the early Christians. So in terms of this particular topic, of course, Jesus is really the first Christian to be persecuted. He was put to death probably around the year 33 AD, although we don't quite know. It's somewhere between 30 and 30 AD. After his death, there was sort of a general persecution against some of the Christians, and we have an early description of this about one of the apostles named Stephen. And what I've got here is a bunch of text, and what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read this particular section, and then I will continue on with this. Okay, well, as you can see, and as you've read, the Apostle Stephen was persecuted. And what's really interesting about this particular text is you have a character or person named Saul, found in 8:1. Down at the bottom, you can see a little asterisk. What this is Saul is Paul. So Paul would become the apostle that we've been talking about. His Jewish name before he converted to Christianity was Saul. And so what you have here in Acts is the story of Saul approving the killing of these early Christians. And of course, I mentioned some of the issues that Paul had when he became a Christian, and this is certainly one of them. And as you can read in the rest of the passage, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And this caused many of the early Christians to scatter, which is usually what happens in a persecution. So during this particular time, the persecution was designed to shut down early Christians and their spread. And what it did is it actually spread them out even further. And I like, as you can tell from some of the slides, I do like some of the artwork that's coming out, and this is an early Renaissance painting titled The Stoning of Stephen. Just after this particular period, you've got a ruler named Herod Agrippa, who is the son of Herod, and he kills James, the brother of John. And you can read about this in Acts 12:1 to 12:3. And again, you can stop the video because I won't be reading this to you. Okay, and then there was sort of sporadic persecution against the Christians as far as we know, in the 40s and 50s. The next big time period for persecution of Christians, especially in the city of Rome, was in July of 64 AD. And what happened during this period is there was a fire, and it destroyed a good part of Rome. And this is during the time of Emperor Nero. And we have a description of this in a Roman senator named Tacitus. He wrote a book called the Annals. And again, what I have here is quite a bit of text. And I think it's on the next 3 slides. I've got more of his text. What I will do is insert a tag on this particular slide. And if you want to read more of this text, then you can certainly click on this. And what I do want to note here is you can see in a few places I've put these ... What that means is I've shortened the text. So I've gone in and taken out what I thought what the important parts were. And so what you can do is click on the tag and read the entire part. And essentially what you'll be reading about is that Emperor Nero blames this fire on the Christians. And again, please stop the video and read this particular section. It's here where there's some really interesting text. I mean, you can see that Nero fastened guilt on a particular group called Christians. here we get the first mention of Christ, Christus, in a text outside of the New Testament. And you can see here there's a bit of description. He suffered the extreme penalty, which of course was crucifixion during the time of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. And these things spread all over. Now I will tell you there is some issue with this particular text. Some scholars think that this section was added by later Christians. We're not quite sure. It's totally possible. And then on this slide again, you should stop it and read. Okay, and what you get here is this description of this pretty horrible persecution. What Nero does is he covers these Christians with skins. They're attacked by dogs. Some were nailed to crosses. And then what happened is that he set some of these people on fire, and they served as lights for some of his parties. What this ended up doing, and you can see this with what Tacitus has to say, is that if anything, this did not turn people away from Christianity. What it did was it made them think about or question what the Christians were really about, why they were going through this persecution. And as you can see what Tacitus says, there arose a feeling of compassion for these people. And of course, it's also related to the fact that many people did not like Emperor Nero. So it was a pretty horrible time for Christians in the city of Rome. One of the charges against Christianity, which is really interesting, is called atheism. And we've heard this term today. I've given you the breakdown of this Greek word. The A in atheism is called alpha primitive. And sometimes when you have an A in front of another word, like theism, it means the negative, or it's called the alpha primitive. Theo means God. So atheism literally means not God, or the negative of God, or they just didn't believe in the gods. And what we're talking about here is the fact that Romans believed that the Christians did not worship their gods, and they were certainly true, and therefore they didn't follow the correct religion. They were atheists. Of course, you'll be reading about this in the book on how the Romans saw the early Christians. So if you haven't started reading that, you definitely should, and this will make much more sense. Another persecution that happened around this time was the Jewish Revolt, and this occurred between the years of 66 and 73 AD. And what happened here is one of the Roman governors decided to tax the Jewish people, and he went into the Second Temple and took some money out of it. And this led to a fairly large revolt against Roman rule in Judea. And at the beginning of the revolt, you've got the Jewish people, and certainly Christians were involved in this. The Jewish people were fairly successful. And this is when fairly large armies were sent in. In particular, one army was led by a man named Vespasian, who was a general. He invaded this area, or tried to take back this area from the Jewish people in 67 AD. And with him was his son Titus. So the father and son went in, led this big push to take Judea back from the Jewish people who were revolting against them. And as you can see here from the slide, what I put here is that Vespasian was made emperor in 69 AD. And so Vespasian left the battlefield and left his son Titus in charge of taking care of the revolt. And that's exactly what he did. So Titus was the one who gets most of the honors for putting down the Jewish revolt. And what you see on this slide is something called the Arch of Titus. Now, if you've ever been to Rome, especially in the Forum, there are a number of these particular buildings, and they're called triumphal arches. So the Romans built these in dedication of usually emperors or famous generals who did something pretty spectacular. And in this case, it was putting down the Jewish revolt. So the Romans built this particular triumphal arch to Titus. And as you can see here, this is my photo. I was in Rome quite a number of years ago and took this. And what I want to talk about next is this image here carved into the Arch of Titus. And what this is showing the Romans taking away material from, let me change the color of this, taking away material from the Second Temple. And what they ended up doing is destroying the Second Temple. So if you remember from a few weeks ago, the First Temple was put up fairly early. It was destroyed during the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. During the time of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, he allowed them to rebuild the temple. And then the Romans destroyed this temple. And what you've got is this very famous image of Roman soldiers taking out pieces of the Second Temple and bringing them back to Rome. And here's a coin of Emperor Vespasian. You can see down here, it's all in Latin. IMPR is sort of imperial, Caesar, CAES, and then you can see the name of Vespasian. And this is the back of the coin. And what you've got here in Latin is IUDEA, Judea, and then captured, CAPTA. So they issued a coin or minted a coin in commemoration of this. The last part of the Jewish revolt was held at an extremely high hill overlooking Jerusalem called Masada. And probably some people might be familiar with this. What you're looking at here is a fortress area that was built by the Jewish people, and it was the last holdout. So the Romans had taken all of Judea, and this is the last bit. And what the Romans ended up doing is building a fairly large ramp made of dirt and stone that reached close to this, and then took it over. And in the process, when the Romans got up to the top, what they found is that the over 900 people there committed suicide. They'd rather commit suicide than be captured by the Romans. After this period, the Romans kicked out the Jewish and the Christian people from Judea, so they weren't allowed to come back in. And of course, once again, this allowed Christianity in particular to spread beyond Judea. The last persecution that I want to talk about took place during the time of Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96. And here you've got a bust of his face. So what Domitian ended up doing is persecuting the Christians, and in particular the Christians that were in his household or with his family. There was one woman named Domitilla that we know of, whose husband was probably a cousin of the emperor. He ended up persecuting their particular family. They lost all of their holdings or their money in Rome. And when Domitian died, the family went back, and Domitilla ended up, according to tradition, donating some of her land that she got back. And today there stands a very famous catacomb in Rome called the Domitilla Catacomb.